Hello, and welcome to Overheard, the Foreign Policy Research Institute monthly podcast that explores the national security implications of intelligence activities, irregular warfare, and political warfare. My name is Philip Wasielewski, and I am the director for FPRI's Center for the Study of Intelligence and Non-Traditional Warfare. Our past two podcasts have discussed Chinese and Iranian political warfare operations against the United States. Today, we're going to wrap up this three-part series on political warfare by discussing Russian political warfare operations against the West and against the United States in particular. Now, the term political warfare was probably first defined by George Kennan early in the Cold War, when he described it as the employment of all the means at a nation's command, short of war, to achieve its national objectives. Kennan saw political warfare in terms of political alliances like NATO, economic measures such as the Marshall Plan, and information operations such as the Voice of America. But he also saw it in terms of covert methods to undermine the communist bloc, such as covert support to resistance movements behind the Iron Curtain. To Kennan, political warfare was the logical extension in peacetime of Clausewitz's doctrine of war being a continuation of policy with other means. While Kennan may have popularized the term political warfare, these operations have been a part of the reality of international relations since nation-states first formed and began to have conflicts with each other. At FPRI's Center for the Study of Intelligence and Non-Traditional Warfare meaning the combination of irregular warfare and political warfare, we define political warfare as the overt or covert employment of elements of national power, including cyber, economic, financial, informational, paramilitary, and political statecraft tools, short of declared war, against a hostile state or non-state actor to achieve political goals, or to protect the United States, allies, and partners from the employment of similar methods by a hostile state or non-state actor. In this context, political warfare should be seen as a statecraft tool normally, but not always, operating below the threshold of armed conflict. With us today to discuss Russian political warfare is Mr. Thomas Kent. Thomas Kent is a specialist in Russian propaganda, information operations, international journalism, and media ethics. He teaches at Columbia University about disinformation. Until 2018, he was president and CEO of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Tom, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here.
Now, to begin, I'd like to ask you to put Russian political warfare operations against the United States in context with our overall foreign relations with Russia. Political warfare can be considered an example of international relations between two nation states in conflict. What are the sources of conflict in U.S.-Russian relations?
In Soviet times, ideology did have a lot to do with it. The Soviets felt that Western countries were implacable enemies that would never allow socialist countries to survive because it would threaten the Western capitalist system when people saw what a successful socialist economy could do. So their only hope was to foment revolutions elsewhere to increase the number of socialist countries, hopefully through propaganda, even in Western countries. Now, Western countries, I don't think, really thought that communism was much of an attraction to their people, but they were repelled by the terror and repression in Soviet bloc countries and by very effective subversion methods that the Soviets sometimes deployed. And so all this led to nonstop geopolitical conflict between Moscow and the West in Soviet times, with each side trying to get as many allies and as many resources as they could worldwide. These days, Russian policymakers still seem to be convinced that the West is out to destroy Russia, while we see Russia as developing into a near-fascist state, more dangerous than ever.
Well, now that we understand these sources of tension, how does Russia use various elements of its state power to the detriment of Western liberal democratic states, including the United States?
Russia basically follows no rules. In fact, it openly mocks what we call the rules-based international order. It says that this rules-based international order was designed by rich countries for the oppression of poor countries, so none of the rules really make sense. So it feels free to advance its interests by any means possible, and that includes political warfare, as you said, like propaganda, spreading a lot of money around to the right people, but also through irregular warfare in the FPRI definition, and that's assassination, blackmail, other means of subversion and intimidation.
When we talk about the Russian political warfare operations today, I'm really reminded that past is prologue, especially what happened during the Soviet era. What are the antecedents of Russian political warfare operations, the past, the history, and are they similar to how the Soviets operated during the Cold War? In asking this question, I'm thinking specifically of two examples. First were communist international Comintern activities for 2 decades after the Bolsheviks came to power. The Comintern, for our listeners, was supposedly an independent international organization founded in 1919 for the advancement of communism, but was actually controlled by Moscow. And the second example I'm thinking of is the later Cold War Soviet active measures that tried to convince world opinion that the United States was responsible for the AIDS virus and other nefarious propaganda campaigns. So where does the Russian playbook of today come from, Tom?
Well, the Soviet Union and Russia do have, as you say, this very long legacy of attempts to spread propaganda about AIDS, about Westerners going around the world stealing people's body parts, all sorts of things. In the 70s and 80s, they tried very hard to rally European opinion against US nuclear weapons with some success. But it's important to note that this Soviet activity, we think about it mainly as propaganda, but in Soviet activities from the 20s to the 80s, it wasn't just about propaganda stuff. There was wet work too, so to speak. Their agents on the ground tried to incite uprisings and overthrow governments in various countries. I'm thinking in the 1920s, activities in Germany, Estonia, Romania, sometimes with deadly results. They assassinated the president of Afghanistan in 1979 and had a role, it looks like, in an attempted coup in Montenegro in 2016. So you see over time this thread of propaganda, but also this thread of really, active activity on the ground.
Your mention of body parts for our listeners, when I was overseas in the 90s, I remember there was a very persuasive campaign, and this is after the fall of the Soviet Union, that was trying to convince the people around the world that the United States was harvesting baby organs for use by rich couples in the United States. This was just part and parcel along with the whole AIDS propaganda campaign of the Soviet active measures, but they never really, although they got wide traction, what effect did they have? How successful were they? And what were some of the weaknesses of their propaganda campaigns, Tom?
I think the biggest weakness in Soviet propaganda was that they were trying to make the Soviet Union look good, when in fact anyone could see that this was a country that was that would not let its people out, where there were no rights, where people were lined up for basic food necessities. So trying to put lipstick on that was a tough climb for them. So I think they did have a lot of tactical successes in making people wary of Western countries, but I think they were less successful about making people love the Soviet Union. In particular cases, they did. Certainly in parts of the global South, they were able to portray themselves as liberators, but people appreciated what they did for them in their countries. But I don't think generally people were very excited about modeling their countries exactly like the Soviet Union. I mean, a few pro-communist activists, yes, but on the whole, people in oppressed global South countries wanted democracy rather than a Soviet type system.
And today, with Russia, what do you see as their tactical successes and strategic successes or strategic failures? Or should we say tactical successes and failures and strategic successes and failures, especially getting the global South to love not the Soviet Union, but Russia and Russian policies?
Again, I don't think that they're very successful anywhere in making people love love Russia, except for what Russia can do for them. Russia provides grain to many countries. It provides fertilizer. I mean, they want that to continue. They want that beneficial economic relationship. But I don't think that people adore Russia. But I think Russia has been successful in in mobilizing people against the West. And it's a very attractive proposition in the global South to believe that all their problems are due to the West, and that therefore the West needs to be overthrown in some way and replaced by something. But the Russians don't really provide the something. They don't have any model, any ideas, any way to make countries more prosperous. They do almost no investment abroad. They do almost no foreign aid. Basically their whole line is just to whip up anti-Western feelings in the hope that they can turn governments for some period of time at least to being friendly to Russia, to backing Russia in the UN, to make it look like all of Africa or all Latin America is gravitating toward Russia and cause panic in Western countries. They don't really offer any way for these countries to get out of the problems that they have. The Russians don't know how to make a country prosperous. They do know how to make a few people in any country prosperous, and they leverage that to try to control the governments in countries. The poorer a country, the more likely it is that a few $100,000 from Russia can actually have some political effect with the elite.
Do you have any concrete examples you're thinking about on that last thought?
Well, I think it's clear in some of the advances that Russia has made in Africa that mining, for example, can be reorganized in these countries away from Western mining companies to line the pockets of Russian companies and, incidentally, the elites that Russia supports in ways that Western laws and regulations wouldn't really allow. Westerners are trembled by all sorts of laws about not giving bribes and this and that. Not to say it probably doesn't happen now and then in some obscure way, but generally speaking, Westerners conduct business in a business-like way, while the Russians can bring all sorts of other tools of influence to bear.
And also a subject of one of our earlier podcasts on political warfare, China, as exhibited in its Belt and Road Initiative. Can I ask now, switching from the global South to Ukraine, although this then switches back to the global South, how does Russia use political warfare operations to support its war in Ukraine? What are its main goals for these operations, and whom do they target besides the United States? Although we can talk about their targeting of the United States too.
Yeah, well, there are huge propaganda operations defending their invasion of Ukraine, particularly in the global South. In Africa, they've created a bunch of new platforms like Afrique Media and African Initiative to promote their views. These are websites, social media platforms, and then they advance those arguments very intensely through every means possible. The thing is that if you get to the global South and the countries that are obviously very far away from Russia, that they're not really front loaded in these countries with suspicion of Russia. I mean, Russia is not a country they think about a lot. It's way over there. I mean, somebody may have been to the 2018 World Cup in Russia and rather enjoyed it, but other than that, it's this very distant power. One thing they do know is it was never a colonial power in Africa, and that counts for a lot. Though one could say that they were essentially colonial powers in terms of the way they related to some of their clan states there. But anyhow, they do not view Russia as a colonial power, And they just feel that the West is forcing them to take sides on something they don't know very much about. That maybe Ukraine is an independent country that Russia stomped into, and maybe it's really just some rebellious province of Russia. And anyhow, why should we not get grain anymore because of what looks like a fight between the United States and Russia? So the Russians have tried to leverage this kind of feeling as much as possible, not just to say that the war in Ukraine is justified, although they will engage on that and claim it is, but also just to claim that this is something that does not concern Africa or Latin America, and that these countries are being dragged by the West into a conflict that they don't need.
Now, when you were at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, how did the U.S. push back on earlier false narratives before the war that came out from Russian propaganda outlets such as Sputnik or RT?
Well, first I should say that Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty are not organized as propaganda organs. They're organized as journalistic companies. As a matter of fact, it's RFE-RL. In fact, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty are now combined in one company. Their staffs are journalists. At RFE-RL, we were not government employees, so it's a private company essentially. And as a journalistic organization, we tried to do honest journalism. We did have certain subjects that we were particularly interested in, like human rights and political freedom and anti-corruption, and we wrote a lot about that, and we broadcast a lot about that. So from the standpoint of Russia, for example, it looked like it was all anti-Russian. From our standpoint, it was just all pro-freedom, and those are the values that we cared about. So we were not organized as a tip of the spear of Western influence operation, but we were very aggressive in pointing out falsehoods in Russian propaganda and in trying to correct incorrect information, in challenging false narratives. So but it was largely from a journalistic, sort of investigative reporting approach, rather than we are the voice of the United States of America, which we were not.
In the Cold War, Russia had the help of its satellites in Eastern Europe to help not only in its espionage operations against the United States, but also its political warfare, or as the Russians called it, the Soviets called it, their active measures campaigns, especially propaganda. Today, who, if anyone, are Russia's allies in its political warfare operations? I'm thinking particularly in terms of China, and could their operations be considered as joint operations, meaning coordinated with Moscow, or simply parallel ones where both have similar objectives and are going about it in parallel but different paths?
I think that on the whole, the Russians are operating pretty much by themselves in terms of controlling their own ecosystem. Obviously, many narratives advanced by China, by Iran, by Venezuela, by Cuba rhyme with Russian narratives. But from what we see, it doesn't seem like they have really coordinated campaigns. In a coordinated campaign, you would expect that at 0300 GMT on a particular day, Chinese, Iranian, Venezuelan, and Russian Twitter accounts would all, put out the same narrative. I mean, that kind of coordination we haven't seen so far. And a lot of these countries have their own priorities. They may all be anti-Western, but they do not necessarily focus on the same parts of the world or speak to the same audiences. So it's not like back in the day when the Soviets could have the Bulgarian Secret Service go off and assassinate somebody in London. It's more of a community of interests regarding certain topics than an ecosystem where Russia directs everybody to do things, or China does.
You mentioned a couple of times in our discussion about assassinations. You kind of referenced the assassination of the Bulgarian. Was he working for Radio Free Europe, Makarov? in
Yes,
London
yes, that was
back in.
a Radio Free Europe commentator who was assassinated by the Bulgarians with a famous poisoned umbrella in London.
And you also made reference to other assassination campaigns that Russia has been conducting worldwide in the past 2 decades against its own dissidents, defectors, and others. Let me ask you this. How is that incorporated into a propaganda campaign or an active measures campaign? What sort of message is that meant to send, and how does it resonate around the world?
Well, assassination is a form of propaganda in a way. I mean, it's very direct with regard to the victim, but its propaganda effect is very substantial in terms of intimidating other Russians from betraying the Russian state. It also raises the possibility that the Russians will assassinate other people who are not Russians. So, I mean, anyone in the world, including, in the global South and the global North, has to think, would the Russians go so far as to assassinate me if I'm inconvenient to them? I don't think there's anything in Russian, ideology or tradecraft that would necessarily prohibit that. They have not chosen to do it, but it's probably, on their list of things to do. They have already listed a number of people in the West as the subject of criminal charges in Russia, various officials and so forth. They've opened criminal cases against them. So the Russians could well say, well, we went to Berlin to arrest this guy and against whom there's a criminal case in Russia to bring him back to Russia, and he resisted, and well, one thing led to another, and now he's dead. So, I mean, the United States goes and seizes people overseas who are wanted by the U.S. And they may well say that we do the same thing, but the big difference is that the Russians do this over issues of people's speech, not narcotics or whatever.
Tom, before we close, is there anything else you'd like to add? And one of the things I was wondering about is if you could also discuss possibly the best practices in combating Russian disinformation from all your lessons learned of dealing with the Russians from the Cold War era to the present time.
Well, we've tried all sorts of things, and media literacy programs, fact checking, independent journalism, education support. There's a lot of stuff that we have done, and support for civil society, and it has been effective in a lot of places. I wouldn't discount it. I think we've made a lot of progress, particularly in recent years. That said, you have to ask, how's it working out for us? If you believe the 10 megabyte reports that land on our desk every day from various think tanks about how the Russians are rolling through Africa and disinformation or whatever, you got to say, well, maybe we still need some je ne sais quoi. Back in the day, Western countries were very active in their own information campaigns, very well organized, very well funded, some overt, some covert, some through various organizations, because in the United States or the UK isn't always the best signature on a message. Sometimes it's better if the message comes from people within a country who have strong democratic leanings themselves. But we don't see the kind of funding and organization and spirit in Western messaging that we have seen in the past. I mean, part of it is because Western countries feel very unsure of themselves. We have all these problems. Who are we to preach to the world? Yes, we do have problems, but I'm not sure that cosmic justice requires letting the Russians walk all over us in propaganda. We also, I think, intrinsically, at least these days, feel that propaganda is a dirty word. And in fact, we try to avoid it. We say things like strategic messaging or whatever. And that there's something sort of dirty about trying to influence people's minds, that there's something cleaner about just killing people than trying which we do a good deal of in different parts of the world, than just trying to persuade them not to be hostile. I think that we have tended to go to the militarized extreme when an awful lot could be done through persuasion. And we've got a good story to tell ultimately if we pulled ourselves together and realized that the vast majority of people in this world would much rather live in the West than they would in Russia or China. Let's think about why that is and leverage that. But sort of the information fighting spirit in the West does not seem to be ascendant, despite quite a number of effective and serious operations. On the whole, it's still pretty nascent these days.
Thank you, Tom. Your comment on the negative connotations of the word propaganda, which is very true, though, kind of recalls for me my Catholic education, where we learned that the word propaganda actually derived from the old 19th century Vatican department called the Office for the Propagation of the Faith. And I think in our case, when we're trying to put out different things to combat Russian disinformation, we're trying to propagate our own faith of freedom and liberal democracy.
You certainly say that we invented propaganda before the Russians did, in that sense. So sure.
And I guess it is just, if you want to get down to the nitty gritty, it is just a continuing battle of ideas between two very different and conflicting ideas espoused in the West and espoused in places like Russia and communist China. Any last words?
Just that in some ways, I think the battle against the propaganda, the disinformation battle is a very important one. I think that ultimately in history, from the Bible to the present, the arc tends to bend toward freedom, people being free, and it will ultimately bend that way sooner or later with some retreats. So I'm confident of that. I do think that if we focus entirely on the propaganda battle and think that this is the main battle, we could lose sight, though, of something else, and that is the irregular warfare from Russia. I think that spending all our time talking about disinformation can be somewhat of a distraction if what we're really concerned about is violence and disruption of our societies in different ways. Propaganda is one way to accomplish it, but there are a lot of other tools that an adversary could use against us, any number of different adversaries. You can just imagine in our country or any other country, some demonstration, some confrontation, suddenly turning violent because of some operator there that made it violent, and then suddenly it becomes this huge thing. And as we know, a demonstration can become violent, or a whole revolution can be spawned by some violent act. And so we have to be alert lest adversaries deploy that kind of thing in terms of just, posts on social media.
Tom, thank you for appearing on our podcast and for an informative, if disturbing, look into Russian political warfare operations against the United States. For our listeners, this is going to conclude our three-part series on political warfare operations for now, although we will return to this subject in the near future. Our next Overheard podcast, and Tom, you may be interested in listening to this as well, is going to discuss the subject of irregular warfare, what it is, how it's conducted, and what is its future. And I'd like to thank all of you again for tuning in to Overheard.